as with each kind of day, we're inviting a kind of person to give us a broad perspective to begin to think about these things as then we dive into the details. So we're delighted to have Merlin Jackson from the Thanet Fishermen's Association. He's been a commercial fisherman for 25 years and now represents the inshore fishing industry in a variety of issues, as you can see. And we're really excited to have him and really set the stage for our discussion all of today. And so Merlin, I'm going to turn myself on mute, turn it over to you, and really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to give a brief talk on some of my experience with fishing on wind farms in the southeast of England. I was commercially fishing until about 12 years ago, just after wind energy got going, and have been involved with wind farms ever since, really. The subject of interaction is very, very broad, and I see the way we are at the moment as a glimpse, really, into what's going to happen in the US potentially. And the difference being, hopefully, that you guys will have a much more informed approach. I know there's limited time, so I'm going to try and focus briefly on one of the key gaps that has become apparent here and is on your agenda later today, which is cumulative impact and how it is considered. In the UK, how the licensing system assesses cumulative impact is quite rigid and does not consider many of the nuances of commercial fishing. And here we're hoping to have an impact on changing that. In my area, the Inner and Outer Thames Estuary supports around 160 vessels from 15 main harbours along about 200 miles of coastline between Ramsgate and Lowestoft. And these fishing vessels often overlap with each other on a variety of grounds. Within the area of these 160 vessels, the constructed working projects include 6 wind farms, covering an area of about 200 square miles, 2 interconnectors, 10 aggregate dredge areas, and numerous telecoms cables. And 5 of these 6 wind farms have been constructed within the last 10 years. As well as the completed projects, we're currently going through a period of planning for new projects with 3 planned wind farm extensions and 2 more interconnectors, plus additional dredge areas and more telecom cables. Many areas of the seabed here have been dredged, had wind farms built and cables installed, and the fishermen have dealt with this so far. But the increase in licenses being sought here is really raising concern about the ability of these fishermen to continually cope with the accumulation of industrial development and what is recognised as cumulative impact. The fishermen like yours use multiple methods adapted to different species, ground types and seasons. Though there are general trends in which species are anticipated seasonally, this can alter from year to year, meaning the fishermen need a variety of available ground and methods that they can utilise and adapt to. The fixed data sets used to evaluate what the fishermen do here and the potential impacts on this fleet are very limited and are openly accepted as flawed, but at present are used as best available to inform licence applications. And yet understanding the constant changes necessary to earn a living from fishing is a vital part of assessing the impact from industrial development on these fishermen. And this is a significant part of what is wrong on how conclusions on cumulative impact are being drawn. This will only be resolved, I think, by better engagement and better sharing of information, which is from both sides. Fishing is a competitive industry, as I'm sure you're all aware, and it doesn't come easily for fishermen to agree or reach consensus, let alone share information. So having fishermen as part of a group to achieve this is far preferable to both the fishing and wind industries. This takes a great deal of energy and commitment to represent fishermen or maintain an association. The fishermen's associations in my area all have experience of dealing with different types of projects, but most of these associations are now dealing with at least 2. In the case of Thanet, which is the association I'm from, 6 project proposals. This in itself is a cumulative impact. The NFFO, National Fishermen's Federation here, is a very good representative body. It's involved in every project, but the increase in project numbers and the volume in the last 10 years means they are also now overburdened. 10 years ago, none of us saw the speed at which wind farms would accelerate. And despite our involvement, now find ourselves behind the curve with this. To a fisherman, the construction of a wind farm presents a combination of fishing and navigational obstructions, sometimes coupled with opportunity, but this is very site-specific. Some fishing methods can become impossible, while others find some protection and some enhancement. Each site means something different to each fisherman. Thanet Wind Farm, was a successful fishing ground, supporting a good mixed fishery through the year, and was fished using static nets, trawls and pots. Following construction, some of those methods were more restricted. The potential to extend had been muted even before the original farm was built, but this did not form part of any of the look into the future at the time. The proposed Thanet wind farm extension, though currently shelved, will push outwards into sandier bottom drift ground and encompass a different type of seabed used by fishermen in a different way. In combination, effects such as these being felt by fishermen as projects increase or extend their footprint have not been sufficiently factored into the current licence process or accurately measured. The wind farms have created welcome opportunity in the form of work ashore and aboard vessels in the Thames estuary, but have brought mixed results for fishermen. Some have used their experience to skipper or crew aboard wind farm vessels, but for those still fishing, increases in project vessel numbers can create different problems. A crewman lost to another vessel with regular wages can be difficult to replace, and the impact can be significant. In each licence application, navigational risk assessments predict construction and maintenance vessel numbers and projected events during the lifespan of a farm, which will increase vessel numbers further still, but these rarely recognise the true numbers or sizes of the vessels that will work on each site after construction. Similarly, remediation and repair work are a reality, but are often understated as a cumulative impact on the fishing industry. For the North Kent fishermen, which is around 55 vessels here, during August 2019, to give you an example, 5 constructed projects, 3 wind farms and 2 interconnectors here added 42 vessels a day to the area worked by this fishing fleet. And though that may have been a particularly high year, as each project arrives, it brings construction, maintenance, survey and repair regimes that are increasingly making the water space busier and ultimately are adding to a cumulative impact and risk for fishing vessels. While wind farms may be the main discussion point today, other cross-sector projects that affect an area need to be considered at the same time. An interconnector can create additional cable crossings and will always have the potential for cable exposures in the future. So it must be considered part of the ongoing cumulative impact, though this is not recognised currently in cumulative impact assessments. In the UK, the current licensing process and assessment criteria within it are not sufficient to assess these and other impacts on the fishermen properly, especially regarding cumulative impact of multiple projects. When trying to judge the impacts on inshore commercial fishermen, licence applications over the last 10 years have flagged significant gaps, and the following is just a few of those. The licence assessment criteria are not suitably defined to properly assess the impact on fishermen. For example, wind farm assessments not recognising some permanent loss of ground to fishermen with certain fishing methods. Cable exposures not being accepted as likely for each new project. Cable exposures are a significant contributor to closed areas and cumulative impact. If deeper cable barrier can be achieved, then another impact is removed. Existing wind farms not being included in cumulative impact assessments, as it is considered that already installed infrastructure is part of the existing environment, so fishermen will already have adapted. If there was only one infrastructure project in the Thames estuary and it was 20 years old, then perhaps that would be understandable, but not when many have been completed in recent years. Active dredge areas not being recognised in combination with infrastructure projects for cumulative assessment. Gaps in understanding the impact of displacement on the fleet and the alternative grounds they can use when displaced by single or multiple projects. Adaptability is a key attribute of these fishermen, but this adaptability shouldn't be used to reduce the significance of an impact. Wind interconnector and dredging developers are improving communication, and this is positive, but these improvements are often isolated from each other. And there seems a need here for a holistic approach further up the chain before a licence application is entered for an energy project or a dredging licence, in order that the implications of granting that licence are understood and the impacts are gauged as completely as possible. But there is a need here, certainly, for developers and licence authorities to understand the impacts a project has when considered in combination with others, as well as the restrictions that are already placed upon fishermen. Many of these are not obvious and are not looked at as part of the licensing process. So how are we trying to look at this a little bit differently? So for my part, in the UK system, while not exclusive, some of the points that I've made with the Crown Estates and various bodies here at the moment to try and steer conversations that we need to have and improve the relationship are things like funding and support for the fishermen's associations to be able to give better representation, which in turn educates fishermen about offshore wind. A concerted look at assisting funding for small associations and representative bodies to nurture good information and a better relationship. No funding often means no attendance, and no attendance means no experience or learning of projects or processes. Creation of valid data sets for vessels, which here has been a significant problem in the past. And also getting those vessels to buy into those data sets has been an enormous deal. Having that data interpreted by the fishermen is perhaps the biggest part of that, because the fishermen are often presented with a great deal of data, most of which is either not relevant to them or they tend to dismiss quite quickly. So having them as part of that is a very big thing. Much better use of existing fisheries liaisons, the fisheries liaison officers and the fishing industry representatives. Fishing industry representative here has become an accepted position since the rise of offshore renewables, and is increasingly playing an important role in understanding the interactions between the two industries. He or she is the most likely to know what combined projects are due in one area and what other restrictions are already in place on those fishermen. They should have a good understanding of the navigation and cumulative impacts that are likely. If regional FIRs, as well as project-specific FIRs, were able to feed into the licensing process at early stages, the genuine impacts of accumulation projects would at least be on the radar, and this would also potentially show a cost benefit to an application in the form of lost time or delays when fishermen object or feel they have not been assessed properly. Here, I'm hoping in the Thames Estuary, the creation of regional groups involving cross-sector developers and fishermen's representatives and licensing bodies, able to have input prior to projects being allocated areas and cable routes. While a wind farm will be aware of other wind farm projects and interconnectors, they're not necessarily aware of dredging projects that will affect the same fishermen. Equally, an interconnector team will be aware of a wind farm and other interconnector proposals, but will not necessarily be aware of export cable repairs, remedial works and closed areas. With the right structure in place, an FIR can feed into this and give a much better picture. Currently, many of these details are not being picked up, and without these crossover, there cannot be an adequate understanding of the cumulative impact on these fishermen, which means there is not an adequate understanding of the mitigation that will be necessary to deal with it. Ultimately, if the wind farms and cable routes are planned in conjunction with fishermen, then every type of impact on those fishermen is reduced enormously, and that will benefit both industries. Better turbine spacings means less displacement, better lighting means safer fishing, and so on. Each of these that can be achieved reduce the impact on fishermen and the developer in numerous directions, and ultimately the cumulative impact. Most fishermen are not anti-renewables or development and are realistic about the need for the marine environment to be used as a resource for other industries. But in order to achieve this and for the benefit of the fishing industry, here certainly there have to be some pretty significant changes. And I think you guys have an opportunity with Rhoda to do that now. So he's hoping that that's the way forward.
Great, thank you so much, Merlin, really appreciate it. Will you have a time, if you're willing, Merlin, to take a few questions? We have a little time for that, and if Maggie, you want to just open up the chat, and if people want to enter any questions for Merlin, and we'll at least, maybe we can't get to them all, but we can at least get to a few before we move to our opening with in just a bit. So any quick questions in the chat people want to raise for Merlin before we dive in? Give this a minute and see what we get. Okay, Merlin, we really appreciate you today. It's really been great. And actually, Peter Hughes. Peter, I'm going to take you off mute. Give me a minute. All right, Peter. All right, see if you can. All right, Peter, you should, yep, there you go.
Hey, good morning. Good afternoon, Merlin. Nice to see you again. I hope you're well during this pandemic. How often are cable exposures problematic to the fishing community? I mean, is this a relatively often occurring thing where these cables become exposed? Because it's a grave concern of ours. We have many fisheries here that use dredges. You know, one of them is the clam fishery that uses hydraulic dredges that actually dig down. They jet water into the sandy substrate to extract the clams. Others are scallop dredges, which, you know, you're familiar with. They kind of bump across the bottom and harvest scallops. And cable exposures, you know, in our little wind farm that we have in Block Island right now, it's been very problematic for us. And we're just, you know, my question, I guess, is this something that we need to learn to expect and live with? Or, you know, I don't know. So I'm appreciative of it. And I'm coming to you from my own little private theater in the house that I've rented. Thank you.
Nice. Yeah, see you again. I think cable exposures are a reality. And I think the part of the issue is with the cumulative assessment, cable exposures are not accepted as something that will happen. It's very unusual here to have an export cable that doesn't have exposure where I live in my part of the world. So it's fairly common. The exposure itself is one issue. Dealing with it and getting the communication of it is another. And fishermen being informed about them is a really important thing. Getting something in place so that fishermen are informed quickly when they do happen. But the other thing that is becoming more important, and on one of the wind farms that we recently worked on, is that the fishermen have some sort of input into how that repair is remediated. So in other words, there are various types of remediation. Some of those will allow specific methods of fishing to continue, some not so much. If you put a rock berm in an area that needs to be bottom drifted here, for example, that's the end of the bottom drift. So getting developers to appreciate and understand that involving fishermen in even how those kind of things are done is quite a big deal. And it's taken us a while, but we are having some traction with that now. But yes, to answer your initial question, I think we have one, off the top of my head, out of the 6 wind farms, we maybe have 4 of those that have had cable exposures on their export cables. So it's not uncommon. There are not hundreds of exposures, and often they're quite localized. And we do have, it's a pretty dynamic here, so we have a lot of tide. But yes, they are definitely something that has to be on the radar.
Merlin, thank you. I'm going to try and get a few of the chat questions in. I'm going to go to Malcolm and Fred, and then we probably will have to finish without getting everybody's questions. But one is just clarified dredging. Merlin, what kind of dredging is taking place? Is it harbor maintenance or something else going on?
It's aggregate dredging here is what I'm referring to. Yeah, so we have active dredging license areas.
Okay, great. Terrific. And then there's a great question about traveling back in time. I'll ask in a second. Malcolm, let me unmute you. Bear with me one second. Malcolm, let's see. Okay, Malcolm, you should be unmuted. Go ahead.
Right, thanks, Patrick. Just to back up Merlin there, everything he said is true. The biggest problem that we have now is that the legislation surrounding cables was applied to the first transatlantic cables 1885, totally irrelevant to modern day business. But the European Subsea Cables Association is fast making the case to, particularly to the UK government, that every single cable must have 0.25 nautical miles of clearance around it, which is something like another 16,000 square miles of seabed, which they say we can't fish. Because the law actually says we would be held liable if we willfully damaged the cables. So that's going to be a big problem going forward, because they all need cables to export the power, and quite often they go through fishing grounds. So I think the insurance companies will be the ones at the end of the day that will have the say on who pays for what. So it could be a big backward step for the fishing industry.
Great, Malcolm, thank you. Okay, Fred, I'm going to try to unmute you. Hang on one second here. Okay, Fred Matera. Fred, let's see. Okay, Fred, I gotcha.
Thanks, Pat. Merlin, it's good to see you again, but I have a question now. I believe I heard you talk about, using fishing vessels to, conduct the research, conduct monitoring, observing, etc. Same thing is happening here now. We're in our infancy with that, but we have used vessels for vessel monitoring, for baseline studies. We are doing some others with observers and just monitoring the grounds to make certain if there are any fishing vessels there. Here's the concern we have. I've looked at several of the developers' criteria, meaning what are the list of inspections and equipment that are necessary for these vessels to engage, and what's necessary for the captains and crews and everything else. It is overwhelmingly onerous, to the point where well, let's just say one developer handed me 13 pages of criteria for an inspected vessel, and there isn't a vessel on the in the United States that would qualify. So are you running into that? Now, I know, having been over in the UK for the last 20-something years with insurance, that, your standards are a little bit higher than ours, that's for sure. Vessels are built to class and you have certificates for your crews and all. But are you finding the same situations there with, do you have to have certificates? You have to have STCW, you have to have SOLAS approved equipment. Because here in the United States, we're in U.S. territorial waters. And my argument, if the Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard approves this equipment, why aren't you? And I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Brad.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The exact same thing is happening here. It's less easy than it's ever been for fishing vessels now to be involved in this kind of work. And I think a few years ago when we came across, and when you came here as well, even then it was slightly easier than it is now. But yeah, the criteria have risen so much. Probably guard work, and even then the criteria for guard vessels is now incredibly high. So it's almost becoming not a mitigation because it's too difficult for fishermen to afford and to pass. So yeah, it is exactly the same.
Great. Merlin, there's a lot of questions we're not going to get to, and we might try to find a way to get some answers, if we can, from you later on. But I think for now, what I want to ask the big question Noah asked, which is, to finish up, if you could go back in time 15 years and do things differently, what would be those one or two things that you would most advise to do differently?
Wow, one or two.
You can give us 15 later for sure.
Okay, I think probably it would be to the fishing industry. And if I knew what I know now, 10 years ago, I think I would have said to the fishermen here, those who perhaps didn't take it maybe as seriously as they could have, really needed to get on board and be more involved. You have to be involved all the time. It's it's quite incredible. So the fishing industry really has to, it's not going anywhere. And I think we thought we knew what was coming. And I think what we've seen is way beyond our expectations now. We never anticipated it would get to the scale that it's going to be, and so I think a lot of the questions that we perhaps raised and thought weren't necessarily relevant at the time. Now I'm looking back, and I know that if I looked at an impact assessment, a cumulative impact assessment from 2010, if I had the opportunity to go back to that assessment now, it would be totally different. Yeah, my opinion would be completely different now.
Great. Merlin, thank you. I think Malcolm's shaking his head, sharing, I think, your view of the health stuff, just noting that. Gentlemen, thank you. Merlin, thank you so much, and really appreciate bringing your experience from across the pond, as they say. So really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All the questions. I'm going to leave the chat open for just a little bit in case people are going to do a little